Well, of course, I would never pretend that Scotland has at any time been a colony. It is a voluntary union and can only be broken by a democratic decision to do so. Francis said earlier that Britain's having its constitutional moment. Well, Scotland's having a constant constitutional moment at the moment. We've been having a constitutional moment for at least 5 years. I often feel that I'm in a constitutional moment Groundhog Day, despite the fact that my reason for coming into politics was the independence referendum. But I also agree with Elliot that I think the moment has passed for remaking the UK constitution for the whole of the UK. And it's really interesting to hear Anthony speak about Charter 88, because when I was a student and still in the Labour Party, I was very much a home ruler and very interested in Charter 88. But over time, I've moved to the conclusion that the only solution for the constitutional imbalance in the United Kingdom is that Scotland should become an independent nation. Although I always very much hoped that Scotland would become an independent nation and go on to be in a union of equals with England in the European Union. And I actually still hope that that will be the case. But I think the Brexit process has underlined, I believe, that I'm right about that, because I think the Brexit process has shown the limits of devolution for Scotland, and also the inequality which Scotland experiences in its union with England. And I think that has really been shown up in very sharp contrast when you contrast Scotland's position within the UK during the Brexit negotiations and the Republic of Ireland's position within the EU during the Brexit negotiations. So I don't believe the Constitution can be remade for the whole of the United Kingdom. I think devolution has failed and the moment for federalism has been passed. And most people in Scotland who are pro-independence will tell you that Scotland's constantly being promised federalism, usually at the door of some impending democratic disaster for the Labour Party, and then it never quite materialises. So I think those of us who want meaningful constitutional change have rather lost interest in the idea of federalism for the United Kingdom. Not to say that it doesn't work very well in other places such as Canada, although don't tell my friends in Quebec that I said that. So I think what I want to say today is really a little bit about why I think we are where we are, because I think the why, as Anthony said earlier, about why we are, how we got to where we are, tells us a bit about how we fix it and what it is that needs to be fixed. I see the fix as an independent Scotland with a written constitution. But I'm really interested to be at this conference because I'm becoming increasingly interested in how we make that constitution. And not just how we make that constitution, but how in Scotland we find answers to some of the crucial policy issues that have vexed the independence debate in Scotland, such as which currency should an independent Scotland use. And recently I've written in the Scottish newspapers, and I'm hoping to stimulate a debate about this at the SNP conference in the spring, about the idea of having Citizens National Assemblies in Scotland. My view being that if a Citizens National Assembly can bring people together in Ireland over an issue as fraught as abortion, then a Citizens National Assembly in Scotland, or a series of them, can bring Scots who have been pro and against independence together on what future policy might be, and hopefully, I would hope, bring more people on board with the project which I care about. But I think in getting to that stage, it's really, really important to understand that in the constitutional debate and the how we fix the British Constitution debate, we need to understand that Scotland is indeed a very, very different country and has become so increasingly over the last 20 years as a result of devolution, for which I will never cease to thank Tony Blair and New Labour. It's one of the best things they did because it's created the opportunity for Scotland to think about its difference and to think about how it can really address that and make policy in a different way. And one of the things that I feel that needs to be addressed is, why did Scotland vote Remain by such a big majority when England didn't? And I don't pretend to know the answer to this question. And I don't subscribe to the view that Scotland's some sort of utopia where everybody is terribly pro-immigration and pro-EU in a way that nobody is in England. That would be far too simplistic an analysis. But I think part of the reason that Scotland voted Remain in such large numbers is I don't think there were the same factors present in Scottish society that pushed a lot of voters into the hands of those who wished to deliver a Brexit. And I think that is because of devolution. I think 20 years of social democratic government in Scotland, first of all under the Labour Lib Dem government and then under the SNP, hasn't created a social democratic utopia, but there is more of a social contract in Scotland, I think, between citizens and the state, and more of a sense of belonging. Just little things like the NHS in Scotland is in better shape. Not saying it's perfect, but it's in better shape. Social housing has been built in Scotland over the last 10 years in a way it simply hasn't been built in England. We've done away with the right to buy in the council sector, and we've also reintroduced security of tenure in the private rented sector, which of course is very important to a lot of people. And I think those things have created more of a social contract between working class voters in Scotland and the state than perhaps exists in England, and there was less of a potential for people to become disaffected and look for something to kick at. And that's my own personal analysis of why Scotland voted Remain in such significant numbers. It didn't need to kick Brussels and blame Brussels for problems which I believe have actually been created by Westminster, because devolution has to an extent, not completely, but has to an extent protected Scotland from post-Thatcherite economics and also from the austerity project. Not completely, but to an extent. But I think what Brexit has shown is that devolution has failed, and I'll come on to that in a second. Devolution has failed to protect Scotland from the consequences of Brexit, quite clearly. I'll come on to that in a second. But the other issue is the equality aspect. And I gave a speech recently at the convention in London where I described Brexit as being a tale of two unions, the union that is the United Kingdom and the union that is the European Union. And I think a lot of Scots have read that tale and watched it unfold and come to the view that really they'd rather be in, if they had to choose between the two unions, they'd rather be in the European Union because at least they would have some hope of being an equal state there. And I think in order to understand that, you simply have to look at what has happened to Scotland during the Brexit negotiation process and what has happened to Ireland, what has happened to the interests of Scotland and what has happened to the interests of Ireland. And of course, Ireland has been centre stage in the negotiations, and this amuses me greatly as somebody who's half Irish with an Irish mother, thank God, because I'll be getting an Irish passport soon. But it's interested me to watch this unfold, because it seems to me, particularly on the Tory benches at Westminster, there's been a sense that eventually the EU would crack and throw Ireland under the bus, because of course that's what Britain has always done in the past. But time is getting very close to the deadline, and there's not much sign of that happening, whereas Scotland has been pretty much firmly under the bus as far as the UK is concerned since the moment that the result was announced. And people forget this because people are getting terribly excited about Jeremy Corbyn's letter to the Prime Minister, which seems ancient history in the light of recent events, and about the Norway Plus option. But very early on in the Brexit process, the Scottish Government suggested a compromise for the whole of the UK, whereby the whole of the UK should stay in the single market and the customs union, which failing there should be a differentiated arrangement for Scotland. Now, the British Government never engaged with that proposal at all in any meaningful way. The Scottish Government said they would like to be involved in the negotiations to some extent. They have been cut out of the negotiations completely, and the JMC, which meets at the whim of the British Government. Anyone who's part of the JMC from the devolved administrations will tell you that it's just a very boring talking shop at which nothing is ever decided. Then the Scottish Parliament voted, not just my colleagues in the SNP, but all the political parties in the Scottish Parliament, apart from the Tories and one Liberal Democrat, to withhold consent to the European Union withdrawal bill, having been told when the Scotland Act passed through that the convention, that legislative consent must be given by the Scottish Parliament, was being placed on a statutory footing. But it turned out that that convention really it had no more meaning than it had had before it was put on a statutory footing, and it was ignored that the Scottish Parliament had withheld its consent. Then the Scottish Parliament tried to pass its own legislation, its Legal Continuity Bill, to create a category of retained EU law for devolved areas and to try and keep the Charter and fundamental rights. The Speaker of the Scottish Parliament took the view that it was ultra vires, but the Lord Advocate, Scotland's top law officer, advised the Scottish Government that it was within the powers of the Scottish Parliament, in which view he was ultimately vindicated by the Supreme Court. But the British law officers challenged the bill before it could be given royal assent, and while the case was waiting to go to the Supreme Court, the withdrawal bill was amended in the Lords to create a retrospective change to the Scotland Act, so that the bill that had been within the power of the Scottish Parliament at the time it was passed became largely out with the power of the Scottish Parliament by the time the Supreme Court deliberated on it. And if you don't think that's a cynical act, I would simply ask you to bear in mind that the amendments were done in the Lords, and when those amendments came back to the Commons, 19 minutes of time was afforded for them to be debated, and the entire 19 minutes was dominated by a British government cabinet minister speaking, and I think Scottish MPs got a couple of interventions, and that was it. And you may recall that that was what prompted, by a somewhat circuitous route, the famous or infamous SNP walkout. And then we come to the withdrawal agreement, where Scotland's not mentioned once. Now, I'm not suggesting there should be a protocol dealing with Scotland, because obviously Northern Ireland's in a very different situation. And obviously Scotland's concerns are different. But the fact that it was possible to create a differential agreement to deal with the concerns about the peace process shows that it would have been possible to create a differential agreement to reflect the difference of opinion in Scotland if the will had been there. But not only is there no mention whatsoever of Scotland in that withdrawal agreement, my colleagues in the Scottish Government didn't get any advance sight of it. The Gibraltar Government did, but not the government in Edinburgh. They just had to wait to read it when the rest of us did. So I think this Brexit process has told Scottish voters a lot about the reality of devolution. Not just that we're not in a union of equals, unlike Ireland, which is in a union of equals, but also that old phrase, and I always forget who said it, I see David Torrance is there, he might be able to remind me, was it Tam Dalyell, but power devolved is power retained. Yeah, power, oh my goodness, well, apologies to Tam Dalyell, wherever you are, but for misquoting you on that. But power devolved is power retained, and that's been made very, very clear by Brexit, because whenever it has been necessary to curtail the views of the Scottish Parliament, it has been done with the greatest of ease, and there have been no constitutional consequences. And I'm not criticising the Supreme Court. There can't be any constitutional consequences because power devolved is power retained, and that is the simple reality of the situation. So when the Scots were told, before we voted in our 2014 independence referendum, that we should stay in a union of equals, we were not told the truth, because this is clearly not a union of equals. And I don't see how the British Constitution could be amended to make us a union of equals. I don't see how that could happen. In theory, there could, of course, be a federal fix. You could find a federal fix for the United Kingdom, but it doesn't seem to me that there's the appetite in England for federalism. And as I say, I think many people in Scotland now, a significant proportion, would be deeply suspicious that federalism could ever be delivered in a meaningful way. And I heard John Bruton speaking about Brexit, the distinguished former Taoiseach of the Republic of Ireland, at an event in London recently. And somebody in the audience, some other mad nationalist, not me, asked him what he thought about Scotland's position during the Brexit process. And I wrote down what he said, because it was really interesting to hear it from an elder statesman from another country. And he said, Scotland's marginalisation within the UK couldn't happen in the European Union. If the European Union were taking a decision as drastic as Brexit, and it had only 4 nations in it, then all 4 nations would need to agree. But in the UK, it doesn't matter that Scotland and Northern Ireland voted to remain. They can always be overridden. And I've said here, overridden by the English vote, and that's not an anti-English comment, it's simply a statement of fact about the constitution of the United Kingdom. Whereas if Scotland was a member of the European Union, even though we're only a country of 5.5 million, we would have the same veto as countries like Ireland or Denmark enjoy over a similar sort of major decision. And so I do think that that is very much the lesson of Brexit, the limits of devolution and the necessity for true constitutional equality, not just a promise which turns out to be meaningless. And I've been quite involved in the campaign for a second vote on the EU, the People's Vote, and I noticed recently that Gordon Brown made one of his famous interventions in the Brexit debate, which many of us in Scotland are a little sceptical about. But I was interested to hear him call for a series of public hearings across the UK on the issue of Brexit. And I think this very much echoes what people like Stella Creasy and Lisa Nandy talked about earlier on in the Brexit process, about having citizens' assemblies across the UK. I kind of think it's a bit late for that in the Brexit process, but I think it would be a very important step for Scotland to hold citizens' assemblies, not just in relation, as I said earlier, to remaking a constitution for an independent Scotland, but also in bringing people together to answer some of the big questions. What currency would an independent Scotland use? Would we want to be part of the EEA or the EU? How would we make ourselves ready for membership, etc.? And so I very much endorse the views of those who spoke about the power of citizens' assemblies, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing more from the speakers tomorrow about them, because I truly think they could be a very important way forward for Scotland in remaking its constitution. And I would just finish by saying that I think it's inevitable, and I was talking to a friend in the Labour Party at Westminster about this last week, who said to me, it's inevitable there'll be another independence referendum in Scotland, and it's inevitable it will be won, and it's pointless people trying to withhold the power to hold that, to hold it. But what I would hope is that that moment of a second Scottish independence referendum and that moment of winning independence in Scotland might be a catalyst for constitutional change in England. And I would add that I think it will always really be very important for England and Scotland to have a special relationship, and I very much hope that that special relationship will be as two independent members of the European Union in the future. Thank you.